Hey, it's John and Mike, brew-dudes.com. Still quarantining it up, keeping our social distance and all of that. I'm practicing emotional distancing at this point, but thank God I have beer. And this is a video talking about my Belgian witbier, white beer, what do you want to call it? I don't know. But this is a proof of concept that you can harvest yeast from Hoegaarden and make a beer that tastes just like Hoegaarden, at least to a certain extent. So if you want to check out the recipe, I did one from my basement a couple of weeks ago. We can put a link in the description below so you can check that out if you want to. But to be honest, this is a tasting video, and I just want to prove to at least one other human being on this earth that
Me?
yeah, the yeast that you can harvest from the bottle is actually the yeast that brings all the flavor to this beer. So, I mean, I'll just talk a little bit more about it. To be honest, the grain bill is pretty simple. Flaked wheat, I think it's half and half, flaked wheat and some Belgian Pilsner malt. I use Saaz hops and then some coriander that I crushed up and the bitter orange peel that you get from the homebrew store. And then a whole bunch of harvested yeast that I made, a couple of, like a starter, and then did another starter from that starter, and that's what we got here.
Yeah.
Fermentation was pretty, I don't know if it was vigorous, but it was certainly like steady. And the temps were in the 68 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius range when I was checking along the way. I used a heating pad just to make sure things were not too cold, but then again, not too hot. Around this time of year, in my basement at least, it's not too, it's perfect, to be honest, for ale.
Yeah, this is a great time to be fermenting.
So, what do you think, Mr. Mike? There's a lot of orange peel in this, and I think that might be an all right thing.
This is 100% nailed it. I mean, this beer is like, just pouring it out without even tasting it, I could tell right away that yeast had, that there is no doubt whatsoever that the yeast that you collected in that bottle is not some sort of post-process carbonation yeast. It is the yeast.
Yeah.
Because you could smell it when I poured it. I had a pretty good rocky head when I first poured it. I mean, it smells everything like it should. There's the coriander, there's a little bit of the bitter peel, but there is all of that yeast ester and the little bit of the phenolic character, 100% there. The color, the cloudiness level, I mean, it could be a little hazier, but it isn't. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. And I mean, the flavor is spot on too. It's a perfectly very soft wheat beer, and all the flavor components are perfectly balanced together. I mean, it's ridiculous, actually. It's ridiculous how spot on for Belgian wheat beer it is.
Yeah, I think what happened is like half of my batch is actually just Hoegaarden. Like, I'm mostly kidding, but I think that when you're taking the dregs out of bottles,
Yeah.
you're taking that much from the bottom of the bottle. I mean, I was
Yep.
Every pour from each bottle, I was not doing what I wanted to do, which was to stir up all those dregs and then pour that on top.
Yep.
I mean, I sacrificed some enjoyment of those beers to do what I wanted to do, which was to harvest the yeast, right? But to not have that, I think there's a lot of flavor components came from the 6 bottles of dregs that I poured into that starter. So that's why, even though I decanted once and then made a new starter, that second starter, I didn't decant anything. I just, it was right after some Hoegaarden. I think it just started to settle down, but there wasn't a lot of yeast stuck to the bottom. I just kind of twirled it around, made sure that it seemed like everything was stirring and active in the solution, and poured the whole thing. So for the 1 liter, like, I think that was probably a 1 liter starter. So it gave me, roughly a half gallon of, the top off the batch that I had brewed.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of Hoegaarden in this, but I mean,
Yeah, but
I think
you'd still need
yeah,
the yeast to do its thing, right? I mean, even if you had 50% Hoegaarden, this tastes like Hoegaarden. So if it was 50% Hoegaarden and 50% the batch, it wouldn't taste as good. I mean, it wouldn't be as prominent, right? I mean, so, and it's not that kind of, you're probably at like a 10% dilution, maybe 8% dilution, but um, I mean, spot on. This is probably the best home brewed version of like a Belgian witbier I think I've ever had. I mean, um, I'm trying like the wit beer that I've had the most is probably Allagash White. Everybody's had
right.
Allagash White. If you haven't had it, go find it. Especially if you can't get fresh Hoegaarden. Like I guess my point is, Allagash White is probably the freshest wit beer we're used to having.
True.
But their process and their yeast is a little bit different than this. But this just hits every receptor in your brain of Hoegaarden, and this is probably pretty close to what Hoegaarden must be when it is very, very fresh. It's great.
Well, thank you. There's one video that I'm sure you can find, and the years have flown by, of course, but there was one white beer that you made, and I was angry because it was so good.
Yeah.
And then I had never made one as good. And I really kind of chalked it up to the yeast that
Sure.
you get out of the homebrew store. And like,
Yeah.
I know that it's supposed to be the same strain,
Yep.
but there was something missing. And I think the other part was I was using malted wheat and not flaked wheat. And I think that was a big game changer for me too.
Yep.
Just the way that this presents as compared to beers that even the American wheat ale that I made, like I don't know, month of February at this
Yep.
point. That was wheat malt as well, and it's a different beer.
Absolutely.
And like the flaked wheat, it has a whole different mouthfeel. There's a slickness to this that I'm so happy about.
Yeah.
That I wouldn't get from malted
No.
wheat.
Yeah.
This hits it on all the marks, and I'm happy.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
it's
this
the
is
best
it.
one I've ever made too.
This is definitely it. I mean, I think what you'd need to do is, I mean, it's still early for us in the season. It's not even really warm. You can't even really call this spring, the weather we're having here, right?
Yeah.
It's, if you were to do this again next year around this time, I would say you've got to save some of the yeast from the fermenter afterwards and make another one, just hold it and make another one, say in, late May, June, so you can have this in the hotter months because it's spot on, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, man, what
So
a good experiment.
Yeah, and I'm glad it worked out, right? You never know. Even there was one of our faithful followers on Twitter was like, "How do you know that the yeast that you collected was the one they use in fermentation?"
Yep.
And I didn't know, but
You don't know.
once the starters started,
Yeah.
It didn't smell like a lager yeast. It smelled like a Belgian white beer yeast, and I was like, "All right, we got something here. Let's see if I can take this to the finish line and have a great beer."
And just so everybody knows
worked out.
Yeah, just so everyone knows what we're talking about, some breweries strip their beer, or let's just say some breweries repackage their beer when they bottle condition with a different yeast than what they did in primary fermentation. Whether they filter the beer or what to get rid of that strain or not, who knows? But in this example, someone had said, well, maybe it's just a packaging yeast. What do you know? You don't know until you try it. But if it was a packaging yeast, it probably wouldn't be flavorful like this, right? So,
Right. Yep.
So it's great. Michael Tonsmeyer on the Mad Fermentationist, this is all for sours and stuff, but he has a pretty comprehensive list of breweries that pasteurize versus breweries that have active yeast. But that's all for like sour beer and stuff. But something like this, I don't think this is on the list. But you don't really see this anywhere else. Like Sierra Nevada puts yeast in the bottle, but is that, I can't remember offhand if that's packaging yeast or the yeast, but it's just Chico, so who really cares, probably, right? But Anyway, that's just one example I can think of. So, I mean, I've got some sour beers that I want to harvest dregs out of from like Allagash and stuff too, but I just haven't gotten there yet. But this is promising. This is great.
Yeah. So if you read online and even you know, some well-known authors who have written books about wheat beers, and they say that, you know, Hoegaarden pasteurizes their beer. They may, I don't know, but
If they
I can
do,
tell
they're
you
doing a good job of it.
the yeast that I was able to collect from the bottles, and of course I was collecting some, you know, healthy samples from the bottom of bottles. I was able to harvest that to make a 5-gallon batch of Belgian white beer. So
Awesome.
I don't know, take that for what it is. I mean, you know, a lot of people are joking, you know, you could just buy yeast from the store, and it's like, that's not what I want to do.
Yeah, man.
And that's why we do what we do. We do this for the tube. So if you like this video, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, because we do this every week. And if you're, you know, hanging out at home and you're saying like, you know what, with all this spare time, I could brew beer at home. Well, here's a channel you can watch, and we put out content all the time. For John and Mike, brew-suits.com, brew on.
Cheers.